I'd like to introduce Nikki Goeser. And as you begin, let me just speak, I'm sure, on behalf of the entire committee to say how deeply our hearts go out to you on your loss and really appreciate your being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm here speaking as a victim of a violent crime. I'd like to give you some insight on how red flag laws can have devastating unintended consequences for many Americans. In 2009, my husband, Ben, was shot 7 times and killed in front of me by a man who I had just realized that very night was stalking me. This occurred in a gun-free zone. I asked management to please remove the man from the establishment because I realized I was being stalked. There was no confrontation or words exchanged with my stalker. When management approached him and asked him to leave, he pulled a handgun, came up behind Ben, shot him in the head, and then stood over Ben and continued to fire 6 more rounds into him. My stalker was in complete control. He was the only one with a gun. Because of the law, I had to leave my legal permitted firearm that I normally carried for self-defense locked inside of my vehicle that night. I obeyed that gun control law. My stalker did not. When police searched his vehicle at the crime scene, they found 2 more guns, ammunition, a baseball bat, binoculars, gloves, rope, and a knife. Ben's murderer has been sending me twisted love letters for years from prison to traumatize me even further. Much to my dismay, he is set to be released early for good behavior in just 7 more years. I have very real fears about what he will do once released. This horrifying experience will be with me for the rest of my life. The days, months, and years that followed were very difficult. Depression, nightmares, grief, trauma, loss, concern for my safety were all things that I dealt with and had to work through. Put yourself in my shoes. How would you feel? I remember thinking at the time, if I just happened to pass away in my sleep, I would be okay with that because I didn't know how I could face another day. I was never suicidal, but you can see where someone may misinterpret that. If red flag laws had been in place in my state of Tennessee, even those with the best of intentions could have had an exaggerated concern and assume they were acting in my best interest by having my guns taken from me. It would be devastating for a victim like me to be unable to protect myself after this stalker violated me in such a horrific and life-altering way. If he comes after me someday, my gun may be the only thing that could save my life. Red flag laws have a real chilling effect and can cause victims to fear losing their rights if they seek help by talking with friends, family, or psychologists. Rights should never be taken from people without due process first, and mental health experts should absolutely be involved in that due process. Under red flag laws, the burden of hiring an attorney and paying thousands of dollars for a representation would be on the person flagged. Who knows how long it could take in court and how much money it would cost to regain my safety? The process is unfair and burdensome. It's not only victims who can be impacted by these laws. Anyone who has dealt with traumatic events can be affected. Police, first responders, nurses, doctors, military, etc. Research varies. There are indications that red flag laws range from having no significant effect on homicides and suicides to an increase. I learned during the murder trial that there were signs my stalker was a danger to others years before he crossed our path. His coworkers, friends, and family knew of these signs. I don't know if those in my stalker's life ever reported him to police, but if they did, just as with Nicholas Cruz, who did the Parkland attack, they didn't act. Ben's murderer threatened to kill his own secretary at his job in Florida. My stalker's father said at trial that it scared the stew out of her. He fired a shotgun out of anger at innocent hunters who were near his property. At this point, he should have been arrested, charged, and convicted. That alone would have prohibited him from possessing and purchasing firearms, but for some reason, that never happened. These are just a few examples of many. He had no criminal record and no mental illness on record, but he certainly should have. Somehow, he fell through the cracks. The people in his life back then could have Baker Acted him. That's where they put you on a 72-hour hold. You have a mental evaluation. The judge looks at evidence, and there's a whole range of options. They can, do the outpatient treatment, removal of guns, or involuntary commitment. I just feel that if someone is indeed a real danger to themselves or others, simply taking away their guns is not a serious response. Red flag laws are overwhelmingly used because of fears of suicide. There are other ways to commit suicide that have similar high success rates. In conclusion, I believe the focus should be on mental health services and facilities in this country, focus on education for the public, training for law enforcement, judges, and prosecutors on enforcement of existing laws like the Baker Act and those similar laws across the nation already. And please don't forget compassion for good people going through a difficult time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Goeser.
And a final question, Ms. Goeser. Thank you for appearing today. Thank you for telling the story of the horrific murder of your husband. And thank you for using the pain and horror of that crime, using it to try to protect others who might be victims of violent crime in the future. Your husband was murdered in a gun-free zone, and you followed the law. You did not have your firearm. You were not able to protect yourself or protect him. That is a familiar pattern with gun control efforts, and many of the mass murders we've seen have occurred similarly in so-called gun-free zones. Are you concerned that the same will be true with red flag laws, that law-abiding citizens could have their firearms confiscated, particularly when they're vulnerable to criminals, but the criminals will refuse to turn over their weapons, and the result will be other potential victims of crime being left vulnerable to violence?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very concerned about that. Of course, there are people who can abuse red flag laws. There are people that can abuse existing laws too, but at least with the Baker Act, different states call it different things, but we pretty much have an option that is the Baker Act. They call it different things in different states, but it exists all over the nation. Every state has a similar law to the Baker Act, and they offer protections. I don't have $10,000 in my savings account to cover legal fees if someone flags me for some reason. It's pretty scary that someone could knock on your door, or law enforcement knock on your door at 5 a.m. and say, hey, we're taking your guns. And you have no idea why. You don't know why. What's going on? I need to be able to protect myself. I just think due process is so important. And mental health experts should always be involved. That should be mandatory. If we're talking about mental health experts should absolutely be involved in that due process. I believe due process needs to come first. Look, if someone is truly dangerous, they need to be confined to a mental health facility. So you take someone's gun away. They're still dangerous. That's how I feel.
Thank you.
He's going to call a brief recess. I'll be back and we can resume then. Thanks, Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you accommodating me in that regard. Thanks to each of you for being here today. The Second Amendment guarantees our right to keep and bear arms. This was a right that our founding fathers deemed fundamental, so much so that they added it to the text of the original Constitution. It's not only the Second Amendment that's at stake when we talk about things like this. There's also the concept of due process. The Fifth Amendment's due process clause, of course, provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That requirement is, of course, made applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment. You see, our freedom isn't free. Whenever government acts, it does so inevitably at the expense of individual liberty. That's where government has to get its power. We need government. And just the same, we need government to respect boundaries on its own authority. I certainly agree that we should take steps wherever possible to make sure that people who shouldn't have guns don't have them. In particular, those who are legally prohibited from having them because they're adjudicated as mentally unfit to do so. They've been convicted of a crime. These restrictions are consistent with our system of laws, and they can be applied in a manner that doesn't offend our constitutional rights. Ms. Goeser, I'm very touched by your testimony as I read through your written testimony. I couldn't help but notice that as you're talking about difficult things and the difficult circumstance in which you had to witness your own husband's murder, even while you had a firearm and had access to it, but you chose to comply with the law, your assailant did not. And I think you summarized it extremely well with just a few words. I obeyed that gun control law. My stalker did not. I don't think I've found any one sentence that better summarizes the need to respect the Second Amendment, the need to protect due process, and also the dilemma that we face and that we have to take into account whenever we choose to enact laws infringing upon those rights. It sounds to me like you would likely agree with the proposition that it's not a cost-free action for the government to take, that in the name of protecting people from the horrors of gun violence, government can also inflict violence. Would you care to elaborate on that based on your experience?
Well, I think that there's some laws that are created that they have unintended consequences. I think some of these gun control laws were created thinking that, we're going to protect people. And unfortunately, it can make some people out there vulnerable so that they can't protect themselves and their loved ones. And, I don't want dangerous people to have access to guns, but you know what? I don't want them to have access to a vehicle or a knife or a baseball bat or a pressure cooker. I mean, if they're truly dangerous, of course, I want everyone to have due process. I believe murderers deserve due process and victims as well. That's what's so great about our country, that we do have due process and we do have a constitution. I don't want to live anywhere else. I love America, and I love that about America.
And yet it's sometimes suggested, and we've heard it suggested even just in the last few moments, that the worst that can happen if you take somebody's gun away without due process is that they have to go without it for a few days or for a couple of weeks. And yet your circumstance would seem to suggest that that is not true, that is not the full extent of the downside of that there is more cost. And sometimes that cost is borne not just in an inconvenience, but in someone being left vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. In my case, it would have compounded the problem. Of course I was depressed. Who wouldn't be? Of course I had nightmares. Who wouldn't after going through that? But to take away my basic human right of self-defense on top of all of that would just be devastating for someone like me.
Sometimes people will argue due process is great and everything, but with respect to the bad folks, well, we can't give them due process. Isn't that the problem with due process itself? I mean, if we're going to respect due process, aren't we agreeing up front that due process needs to be up front? It's not really due process if it's only after the fact. Is that right?
That is right. And I understand it can be very scary. I mean, I get it. I get it. I'm a victim of a violent crime. But like I said, if you truly believe that someone is a danger, they should be confined to a mental facility, but they should have due process. And that's why I support the Baker Act and similar laws that already exist all across the nation. Every state has a similar law to that because it includes due process. Your Your legal fees are covered. They're not under red flag laws. I don't have $10,000 to cover legal fees. It can be very, very expensive. And with the Baker Act and similar laws, mental health experts are involved. That's not always the case with red flag laws. And I think that's very important that mental health experts be involved in that due process.
Thank you. Ms. Goeser, in your opening testimony, you testified that red flag laws can have a chilling effect that can cause victims to fear losing their rights if they seek help by talking with friends or family or psychologists. Can you elaborate on that concern, please?
Sure. I think that when people fear that, someone may be very, very, very depressed and still be concerned for their own safety, which I'm sure to some people that doesn't make sense. But when people are concerned that they're going to lose their rights, they bottle up. Like they're not going to want to share their feelings. And I just think it's best that these people be able to get, mental health help. And if they feel intimidated, if they feel like they might lose their rights, it could actually have the opposite effect from what you want.
And advocates for red flag laws often focus on the benefit of removing a firearm from a potentially dangerous person. And there's no doubt that with someone with serious mental illness or an intent to do real harm, that can be a very real benefit. But they also diminish the harm of removing a firearm from someone who might be a victim of violence, for whom that firearm might be the difference between surviving a violent attack and not surviving a violent attack. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I've got to tell you this. I think, and I've gotten to know a lot of victims. I've actually brought my friend Amanda Collins Johnson with me. She's sitting just behind me here. She was brutally raped on her college campus. It was, of course, a gun-free zone, and it was in the student parking garage. She had her permit to carry, but because she was obeying that gun control law, she left her gun at home. She wasn't allowed to have it on campus. And that's where a serial rapist found her on her way to her car in the student parking garage. And he brutally raped her right there in the garage. And I've gotten to know a lot of other victims, and they all want the ability to protect themselves. But we also fear that, some of our attackers are going to be released. People seem to think that if you do a horrible, violent crime, that you're just going to be in prison forever. That's not true. Murderers, really horrible people that do very violent things, they're let out of prison every day in this country, unfortunately. And that's very scary for us. And victims want to be able to protect themselves. But here's a scenario perhaps you've not thought of, which absolutely terrifies me. When my stalker, my husband's murderer, is released one day, what would prevent him from taking out a red flag on me to purposefully disarm me so that he can harm me? That's terrifying. That's just something to think about.
Well, thank you, Ms. Collins Johnson, for having the courage to be here and allowing your story to be told. And Ms. Goeser, thank you for speaking on her behalf and on behalf of so many victims of violence.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'm struck as we come to the end of this hearing by the points of agreement, perhaps unintentional. Ms. Goeser, your point about people who have mental illness, perhaps being reluctant to talk to friends or professionals, is exactly the point that Senator Durbin made. I don't know whether you recall, but he said people should not be separated from firearms simply because they have a mental illness. It's dangerousness, it's risk, it's potential harm to others. That murderer would have no basis, none, for going to a judge and saying, Nikki Goeser is dangerous, a risk of harm to anyone. On the contrary. And likewise, Senator Cruz and I are both Federalists. I was a state attorney general for way longer than I've been a United States senator. I believe in states' rights to enforce their own laws, indeed to make their own laws. And that is the whole purpose of our proposed red flag statute. Not only to encourage states to make their own laws, but to make them better. So when they do pass their laws, they look more like, thanks to Mr. Koppel for his compliment to Connecticut, more like Connecticut than, say, one of the other states that he found less protective of constitutional rights. If they're going to be laboratories of democracy, better to elevate the results of those laboratories than let them kind of muddle along and fail to protect the rights of American citizens. So I think there's a lot here where we have common ground, as long as we don't become distracted. And I understand your point about gun-free zones, about permitting the most heinous kind of lawbreakers, perhaps to go free and threaten others. We ought to prevent that. But we're talking here about a more narrowly crafted law with a more narrow purpose that can be surrounded by all kinds of protections relating to what has to be proved in the way of factual evidence, the standard that has to be met, not just probable cause, the protections for individuals. You know, you could say that someone who's unable to afford an attorney has to be provided with one. I'm just thinking out loud here. But my hope is that we can go forward and sort of focus on the common ground, because if we do want states to be the laboratories of democracy, better to make them good laboratories and protective of constitutional rights than allow them to just go forward without encouragement to adopt higher standards. I think Mr. Koppel has been very frank on the issue of whether there are authoritative studies. A lot of the evidence here is anecdotal. It relies on common sense, that if somebody says, I'm going to shoot people in Parkland, I'm going to kill students, and as Senator Graham has said, the shooter practically took out an ad in the newspaper and said, I'm dangerous, that it makes sense to give the police, and I take his point about the police, which is in the Connecticut statute, the authority to make their case, maybe screened by a prosecutor, as happens in the state of Washington. We've heard Ms. Wyatt describe that procedure with all kinds of protections and bells and whistles, rather than allowing that shooter to just go ahead. So I think I am determined to try to seize that common ground and make the case that we can work together on these kinds of statutes. I'm willing to hear from any of the witnesses who want to make any sort of final remarks, or Senator Cruz if he has anything. Mr. Horowitz?
I just want to thank everybody for the committee, for Mr. Chairman, for the ranking member, for giving this a fair undertaking. And I really believe that we can reach an agreement here. I think it's important to save lives. I think we can protect due process. We can protect constitutional rights and save lives. And for everybody on this panel, I think we want to come together, and that's what we want to do, is save lives. And I hope the members of this committee can hear what we've taken today, craft something that really works, and save lives. So thank you for this time. I'm deeply appreciative of being here today and for this very serious consideration.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Thanks to Senator Cruz and all the colleagues who appeared here. The record will remain open for 1 week, and anyone with questions can submit them. We appreciate your being here today. Thank you very much. Hearing closed.